Viv, setting up this meeting. It's really wonderful to have the opportunity to come and speak to a global audience. I'm coming to you from Australia. It's nighttime and pouring with rain, and so I hope everything holds together here. Really, yeah, wonderful to see some familiar and not so familiar faces as well. So, yeah, I hope this talk will give us a sense of perhaps what I've been thinking about in terms of the relevance of paleo-data for conservation in the Indo-Pacific region in general. Yes, we talk about Madagascar, of course.
Simon, sorry. I think your connection's a bit patchy, so some the interpreters requested, would you mind turning your camera on while you speak, just to improve the sound?
I can try and do that, yeah.
Thanks so much.
Okay, that's all right. So my research interests focus on tracing the influence of people on ecosystems, big issues like the Anthropocene, exploring the concepts of ecological tipping points and alternative stable states through the Quaternary, and really the relevance of paleo-data conservation and that's what we're obviously talking more about today. And as I mentioned, I work across the Asia-Pacific region, but have to work in Madagascar and the Comoros, and work with peoples of that region, looking at the notion of how people may have influenced ecosystems through time. So the two big questions I guess we're looking at today in many ways is, does biodiversity conservation really need paleoecology? Is it relevant to modern day conservation? And also, what role can paleoecology play in protecting, particularly freshwater ecosystems? But also, I think very importantly, think about the notion of what role it can play in the rights of Indigenous communities on who rely on many of these ecosystems. There's been a lot of thought in this space, and there are examples of biological management proxies that answer some of these big management questions. And here's some examples from Sandra Nogwe and others recently who published on this, and look at questions of what impact invasive species can have on ecosystems, the role of fire, herbivory as well, all these drivers of and factors in ecosystems that play an incredibly important part in this quest to really use paleoecological data to help inform management decisions. So I'm going to give a couple of examples today of work that we did back in around 2011. And I worked in Madagascar with local researchers and others to try and build a cross-disciplinary examination of the environmental history of certain parts of the island. The first example is from the southwest near Toliara, quite a well-studied region and quite critical in terms of environmental change. Forests, in the last decades, and shifting agriculture for maize in the dry forests is some of the key drivers of deforestation. And some of the xerophytic bush on the red sands appears heavily threatened particularly by charcoal exploitation, which is a key subsistence product and strategy for local communities to survive, essentially. And a large part of this landscape has, in many ways, become co-managed and protected since about 2003. So we took a core from this area in 2011, revisited a site that David Burney had cored many years ago, and reanalyzed some of these sediments and looking at the bone deposits as well, the extinct mammal deposits that were well preserved in this site. And this is the sediment summary of the pollen record, charcoal record, and dung fungi record, a proxy for herbivory on the site. And it showed quite a detailed history of and quite dramatic changes that occurred in this area since the Holocene. And this is published in a landscape ecology journal with Malika Viraswamy, who helped count the pollen from the core that we collected. But you can see here quite a dynamic series of changes, and these changes reflect a shift from quite humid forests in the mid-Holocene, a very dry, quite extensive hiatus period, and then the development of this xerophytic shrub and non-analog, really, palm pandanus savanna in this environment, which changed quite rapidly. You get local extinction of some of this flora about 1600 years ago, and alongside megafaunal extinction, and then subsequent arrival of the sort of agro-pastoral system and cattle into this area, and quite dramatic shifts in the fire regime as well. And so by examining this, we can really start to look at what the fossil pollen data can tell us, both from the terrestrial environment and the aquatic ecosystem. And it shows really how sensitive these arid adaptive species were to past climate change, and how rapidly these changes can occur, particularly between about 1,000 and 500 years ago. And Malika also did an extended analysis to look at how the local vegetation and these local habitats were changing, and how sensitive they were to either climate or human impact, depending where they were on the landscape, whether it was in a topographically dynamic landscape. All these factors can tell us quite a bit about how sensitive these systems are to not change, but human impact as well. And we were able to identify in this paper resistant, resilient, susceptible and sensitive habitats, and particularly the xerophytic bush places within the sensitive habitat area. And on this two-dimensional graph here. And in this way, we can identify different approaches to sort of integrate the conservation approaches and adaptive strategies in these contrasting habitats. And by thinking about the Palaeo-data and what it can tell us alongside the conservation strategies, it enables us to tackle these different areas, different regions in different ways, essentially. The second example is up in the Highlands in Tanna, essentially. We also worked in some of these highly modified wetlands. Today, often either used for rice or tilapia ponds, a whole range of different uses, right next to the sort of urbanised landscape. And rice is obviously a big factor in this transformation. Again, we took a core here, and this core extended quite far back. The beginnings of, or the ends of stage 3, around 30,000 years ago, and showed a really dramatic story about the montane history of the region around Tanna, and up until the present. And what it showed, again, a summary diagram here of the sort of last glacial maximum period through to the Holocene, some 20 of history, but it really shows critically that the record has a long history of grasslands in this region, and grasslands are obviously a key controversy in Madagascar regarding their origin and antiquity, but clearly records such as this and others that are emerging across Madagascar show a deep antiquity of grasslands and the association of fire as well. And you can see the charcoal record here showing a deep history of the fire well beyond purported arrival of people into this environment, whichever sort of line of evidence you want to take there, whether it's early or late. The charcoal is certainly present well before that into the glacial period, suggesting that fire and grasslands are really a key part of this environment and have been modified for sure by people. But, the use of fire could be suggested as critical to the maintenance of these grasslands. And so in this site, I think it really does again show how the pollen data shows how sensitive montane species were to past climate changes and more recently to human impacts and the development of rice in this highland region. And many of these wetlands, these montane wetlands, were in fact heavily modified by communities who are today reliant upon them for subsistence and food. But of course, to do that, there was clearance of some of these sort of wetland forest systems as well. So these potentially have, in many places, been locally extinct, but could well be a part of the kind of efforts towards conservation of these perhaps resilient but and susceptible swamp and littoral forest habitats in so overall, we can look at those two big questions again, I think, and the question of does biodiversity conservation in Madagascar need paleoecology? And I think these two examples and many other examples we'll see today or hear about today can show us, one, how sensitive these different species are to past climate change and different ecosystems. And these can in many ways be ranked on those four big categories of resistant, resilient, susceptible, and very sensitive. And this kind of notion in hand, we can help local or classify these local habitats today, and can help to really identify different ways in which to apply our integrated conservation and adaptation strategies in these contrasting habitats. And this is a concept that's really been developed by Lindsay Gilson and others in the region. And I think, putting it in this kind of framework can actually provide a mechanism for not only using paleoecology, but communicating the results of paleoecology to current land managers. And really the second question, or two questions really, what role paleoecology play in protecting freshwater ecosystems? And I think ideally this, we can use our records to identify the kind of tipping points and drivers of change in freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems, and start to think about really the interplay between the terrestrial and freshwater systems that are clearly responding to one another, or are interlinked in key ways. I think on the ground, when we are doing this kind of work, it's a really powerful way to acknowledge the long-term role played by Indigenous communities and local communities in creating and managing these ecosystems on whatever timescale they might be working on. Here in Madagascar, it's in terms of many centuries, but in a place like Australia, it can be many millennia. But I think the ideas and the notions are the same here, and our data, whether it be on the use of fire, use of wetlands, use of certain ecosystems, can be really powerfully employed and used as a mechanism of starting conversations about how ecosystems can be served. But of course, on that, we need to really be realistic about the data limitations, and this is a critical part of the conversation I guess we'll have today, is about how we can extend or use our data through time and use it in a realistic and sort of sensitive way within the communities in which we work. And I think I'll stop there. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.
Merci beaucoup. D'avoir organisé cette réunion. Très heureux de pouvoir tous vous retrouver.
And so I hope everything holds together here. Really, yeah, wonderful to see some familiar and not so familiar faces as well. So, yeah, I hope this talk will give us a sense of perhaps what I've been thinking about in terms of the relevance of
Commentaire de l'interprète, nous avons beaucoup de problèmes de son, beaucoup de problèmes de connexion. Votre connexion n'est pas idéale, alors l'un des interprètes a demandé, pourriez-vous couper votre caméra pour améliorer la bande passante? Oui, je vais essayer. Je me concentre sur l'étude de l'influence humaine sur les écosystèmes, sur l'Anthropocène. J'explore les concepts de points de bascule écologiques et les états stables alternatifs au cours du Quaternaire. Et la pertinence des paléodonnées pour la conservation et la gestion. Je me concentre dans la région Asie-Pacifique, mais j'ai travaillé énormément à Madagascar et aux Comores. Et j'étudie l'impact humain sur les écosystèmes à long terme. Les deux questions qui nous concernent aujourd'hui. Première question, est-ce que la conservation de la biodiversité à Madagascar a besoin de paléoécologie? Deuxième question, quel rôle la paléoécologie peut-elle jouer dans la protection des écosystèmes d'eau douce et dans les droits des communautés autochtones?
There's been a lot of thought in this space.
Beaucoup d'études ont déjà été effectuées en la matière. Commentaire de l'interprète, nous avons des très grosses coupures de son.
Recently, who published on this, and look at questions of, what impact invasive species.
Et donc, comme vous le voyez, l'une des questions qui a été posée, quel est l'impact des espèces invasives dans les écosystèmes de biodiversité, dans ces écosystèmes à Madagascar?
So I'm going to give a couple of examples today of work that we did back in around 2011.
Voilà le travail que nous avons effectué en 2011. J'ai travaillé à Madagascar.
Cross-disciplinary examination of the.
Et là, nous avons fait un examen pluridisciplinaire des aspects géologiques. Alors, tout d'abord, au sud-ouest, Toliara, une région beaucoup étudiée, très importante, notamment pour la compréhension du changement climatique.
Some of the xerophytic bush on the red sands appears heavily threatened particularly by charcoal exploitation.
Cependant, la surexploitation du charbon dans la région pose problème. C'est un produit qui sert de source de revenus aux communautés locales. Une grande partie de ce paysage et donc une grande partie de cette région est devenue une zone éco-gérée depuis 2003. Nous avons donc visité un site et nous avons utilisé les relevés de pollen sur la base donc de sédiments et on a regardé les dépôts bien préservés sur ce site. Nous avons donc des statistiques, des données pour les spores fongiques, pour le pollen et pour le charbon. Et comme nous le voyons à l'écran, il y a eu beaucoup de changements au cours des différentes périodes. Et ce que nous voyons ici, beaucoup de changements dynamiques, et ces changements sont les suivants. Donc, on est passé d'une forêt humide à une période très sèche. Ensuite, on est reparti vers une extinction locale rapide de la flore. Une extinction mégaphonique a ensuite eu lieu pour ensuite se diriger vers un système agricole et pastoral où l'utilisation du feu était aussi répandue.
By examining this, we can really start to look at what the fossil pollen data can tell us.
Que peuvent nous dire les dépôts de pollen? Alors, comme vous le voyez, il y a eu nous avons effectué des analyses poussées
changing and how sensitive they were to either climate or human impact, depending where they were on the landscape.
Alors, comme nous le voyons, il y a un impact du climat. Commentaire de l'interprète, nous avons des coupures de son intempestives.
And we're able to identify in this paper resilience.
Ici, ce qu'on a étudié, c'est la résistance, la résilience, la susceptibilité et la sensibilité de ces habitats au changement climatique. Donc, pour ces habitats, sur ce tableau en 2 dimensions. Et de cette manière, nous avons pu identifier différentes approches pour développer des stratégies d'adaptation et de gestion de ces habitats. Les données paléo s'ancrent autour de notre stratégie de conservation.
The second example is up in the Highlands in Tanner, essentially. We also worked in some of these highly modified wetlands today, either used for rice or tilapia ponds, a whole range of different uses right next to the sort of urbanized landscape.
Alors, ce que nous voyons ici, une analyse d'une surface qui se trouve à côté d'une zone urbanisée. Alors, alors, on a étudié des dépôts qui ont d'environ 30 000 ans, et là, de 30 000 ans. Et ce que nous voyons ici, c'est une analyse de cet environnement montagnard. Et ce que nous voyons ici, donc la dernière période glaciaire jusqu'au Holocène,
but it really shows critically that the record has a long history of grasslands in this region, and grasslands are obviously a
alors il y a les terres, les prairies, comme vous le voyez, qui sont fortement répandues à Madagascar, et ce depuis très longtemps, mais c'est les données que nous avons sur tout Madagascar. Commentaire de l'interprète, toutes nos excuses, nous avons des coupures de son intempestives. Commentaire de l'interprète, nous ne comprenons pas, il y a des coupures de son intempestives, toutes nos excuses. Il semblerait que les prairies et que le feu fasse partie de l'histoire de cette région depuis de très nombreuses années.
And so in this site, I think it really does again show how the pollen data shows how sensitive montane species were to past climate changes.
On a donc étudié les espèces montagnardes et on a regardé la mesure dans laquelle elles étaient sensibles au changement climatique, et ce depuis l'époque de l'Holocène. Alors l'analyse à long terme montre que ces prairies, ces pâturages sont un écosystème antique et que le feu fait d'ailleurs partie intégrante de cet environnement depuis des temps immémoriaux. Les zones humides montagnardes sont fortement modifiées par les communautés qui ont besoin de ces habitats, notamment pour la culture du riz. Et il y a d'ailleurs très peu de marécages forestiers montagnards qui persistent. Et garantir un habitat forestier résilient au niveau des marécages et au niveau du littoral font partie des systèmes d'adaptation et de conservation intégrés, et tout ceci doit être inclus pour lutter contre la déforestation. Alors la question, est-ce que la conservation de la biodiversité à Madagascar a besoin de paléo-oncologie? Eh bien, ce qu'on va voir aujourd'hui,
different species are to past climate change and different ecosystems. And these can, in many ways, be ranked.
On verra quelles sont ces différentes espèces. Nous le verrons, il est possible de les catégoriser en 4, à savoir les espèces résilientes, susceptibles, résistantes et sensibles.
Classify these local habitats today and can help to really identify different ways in which to apply our integrated conservation and adaptation strategies in these contrasting habitats. And this is a concept that's really been developed by Lindsay Gilson and others in the region.
Donc ici, nous développons un système de conservation pour la région qui regroupe ces 4 catégories.
And really, the second question, or 2 questions really.
Alors la question suivante, quel rôle la paléoécologie peut-elle jouer pour la protection des écosystèmes d'eau douce et pour protéger les droits des communautés autochtones qui y vivent? Eh bien, l'idée ici, c'est d'identifier des potentiels points de bascule et des manières et ce qui change les écosystèmes terrestres et d'eau douce. Cette approche peut nous permettre de mieux comprendre le rôle à long terme que jouent les communautés autochtones pour créer un des meilleurs systèmes, pour améliorer les systèmes de gestion existants des écosystèmes. Mais il ne faut non plus pas, il faut rester réaliste vis-à-vis des limitations des données. L'obtention, la collecte de données n'est pas toujours évidente. Donc ici, nous avons fait ce qui était possible. Ici, en Australie, nous avons des données qui remontent sur plusieurs millénaires. Commentaire de l'interprète, encore une fois, toutes nos excuses, nous avons des coupures de son intempestives. Nous entendons une phrase sur deux.
But of course, on that, we need to really be realistic about the data limitations.
Mais je le répète, nous devons être réalistes quant aux limites posées par la collecte de données. Ce sont des questions que nous pourrons poser aujourd'hui. Comment pouvons-nous étendre ces données, les conclusions que nous avons au reste de nos activités? Très bien, j'en ai fini. Et je vous remercie de votre attention.